Hi everyone, welcome. Hello, you are at Infrastructure as Product, Building GitHub's Future. And in this session, we're going to talk about that very idea, treating your internal infrastructure as a product. I'm going to explain, what that means to me, why I think it's a good idea, and then we're going to cover some of the important themes of that practice, and then illustrate those themes with examples from GitHub's work. To be clear, this talk is not a rundown of GitHub's infrastructure stack, nor is it a tutorial about Kubernetes. Some of those tools will come up, but we're going to focus on how infrastructure impacts people rather than any technical details. So don't leave yet. So before we get too far in, I'd like to introduce myself. First things first, I am not, sadly, Sophie Haskins. I'm Kelsey Gilmore-Innis. I'm lucky enough to be Sophie's manager. I work with Sophie on an amazing team here at GitHub called Production Engineering Delivery. We are responsible for the infrastructure that engineers at GitHub use to run their code in production. Sophie wrote these slides and these content. She unfortunately couldn't travel to SF today, so I'm filling in. I work with her on this project, and I share her philosophy and her excitement, but these are her words and ideas, so all credit to Sophie. Sophie wants you to know that her career has mostly been building infrastructure for internal use at medium to large tech companies whose main product is a website. Her feelings about infrastructure are colored by that experience, and the way that we discuss infrastructure today is going to be in that frame of reference of a tech company who delivers their product via a website or API. So, infrastructure as a product, what does that mean? Well, let's get into it. Let's start with what is infrastructure. So me and my team work on infrastructure. Specifically, we work on software infrastructure. We build and maintain the tools, the technologies, and the practices that other developers at GitHub use to produce GitHub itself. To me, infrastructure is made up of three things. It's, as I said, tools, technologies, and practices. Tools are things like configuration management systems, cloud providers, deployment automation, monitoring systems, and source code repositories. Technologies are things like Linux servers, containers, everybody loves containers, caching, virtualization, and distributed tracing. And practices are things like continuous integration, checklists, on-call rotations, and service-level objectives. Now, when we build infrastructure, we often focus on notions of technical correctness, on objective performance, or on really clear binary service-level objectives, right? But at its root, infrastructure is there to provide a stable foundation on which to build whatever it is that your company does. It's a platform to support your business goals. How does that differ from a product? Well, traditionally, products are like the things that your organization exists for. If you're a business, they're how you make money. A product makes someone's life better in some way. It differs from a commodity because it tells a story about how your life is better when you use it. It doesn't have to be a good story with plot and a conflict. It could be something as simple as like, our compiler is faster, so you have more time to focus on what matters. Or this editor has a colorful theme that makes you smile, right? A product's story reflects its creator's vision of how it's going to improve your life. And the best products tell a compelling and a coherent story about that vision in a consistent voice. A product's story is also an opportunity to build trust and familiarity with its customers. The easier it is for someone to see how a product would improve their life, and the more compelling that vision is, the more likely they are to pay money for it. Finally, a product provides those benefits to a specific audience. That's one thing that distinguishes a product. It's built to fulfill like the particular wants and needs of a specific, discrete group of people. The product supplies something that its target audience demands. And so another way of saying this is it's a market, right? Supply and demand. Finding the right market and serving the people in that market well is really critical to the success of a product. So how does infrastructure fit in with that idea, right? So one of the things that I want to go back to was that last bullet point about infrastructure. Infrastructure exists to help other humans. I worry sometimes that folks working in infrastructure forget that, right? Operations teams have a really long history of being grumpy and being hostile to their users, and I think we've probably all experienced that. Infrastructure has this reputation of somehow being more technical or more objective than other disciplines, and I've worked with coworkers who've said things like, I don't need anyone to help me decide on what to work on. I know what's right to work on. Or, our system is fine, it's the user's fault, right? That sort of problem exists between keyboard and chair attitude. I don't like this. Infrastructure exists to help other people. If you're working at a company, it exists to help those people meet business goals. As mentioned, we often in infrastructure focus on notions of like technical correctness, objective performance, these SLOs that you can hit or not hit. But those motivations for us to build infrastructure, they can miss what the humans that we're supporting actually want and need in order to do their jobs well and in order to move the business forward. When we ignore that human element, we can miss some of the ways that having a coherent narrative about our infrastructure can really improve it. As humans, one of the things that we do is we establish norms through narratives that we tell. Tooling and technology is obviously important, right? But infrastructure in practice relies really heavily on shared norms, shared values to operate. Some example of norms are something like, you don't deploy without testing your code. That's a norm, right? Services should be thoroughly monitored. That's another norm. Yeah, monitoring. The DevOps movement, which I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with, provides a great example of how a narrative, and that narrative roughly is, what if developers and operators acted like they were on the same team? It's a really good example of how that narrative makes for stronger infrastructure systems. And then finally, to tie it back to sort of the last definition of a product, even though we are building internal tools for internal users, we argue that we actually do have a market somewhat analogous to what our external products do. We create our internal infrastructure for a specific set of users, right? It's our coworkers, specifically it's our developer coworkers, and it's actually even often a smaller section of those. And those people have a specific set of pain points. Now, in some cases, if we don't serve those problems well, we can actually lose those customers, right? They may be able to choose a third-party infrastructure provider or an infrastructure product like Azure or Heroku. But even if you do have a mandate to provide infrastructure to your org, because of how important those norms are, adoption of and engagement with your infrastructure is really critical to its success. And anyone who's worked in operations or infrastructure will tell you, right? Devs will go around you. They will do the bare minimum to get you off their back, and they will resist you if your infrastructure doesn't meet their needs. So you actually kind of have pretty similar motivations to external products in terms of wanting to find and create that fit between your product and your market. So why now? Why is this something we decide to focus on now or that we think is important now? Couple reasons. One is the DevOps movement, which I mentioned. The DevOps movement has sent waves to the industry, and it's really raised the bar for infrastructure engineers. It's asked us to think beyond just the technical, right? And to think about humans. It also emphasizes that the interactions between developers and infrastructure engineers should be more than just a single point of handoff. I see our approach, which treats those interactions between those two groups as a full-blown interface, as very much part of this DevOps movement. Another reason that we think it's a good idea now is that every year more and more tools come out that help abstract away more and more of that sort of busy work, that toil of boilerplate operations. The less that we have to focus on getting the machine to work, the more time we have to focus on why does the machine work this way, and critically, what is this machine for? Very important question. The Kubernetes project, great example of this, right? The abstractions that Kubernetes uses are really well suited to the problem domain of running some software on some servers, which is a problem that lots of us are familiar with. It's a rich toolkit for doing that and doing it reliably. It's a basis that allows us to ask more about what are we running and why, instead of, how do I get it to run? The final point that we think contributes to why we believe this is sort of the wave of the future is the broader movement towards a less homogeneous tech industry. That reminds us that people matter, right? Technology is made, even Kubernetes, by and for humans. There's incredible diversity of people in the world, and there's incredible diversity of people building applications in the world. And that means we need to realize that the people using the infrastructure we build are likely different from us in some way. That means we might not be able to, and we might increasingly be less able to do well, to just guess what's right to build. We need to focus how we build our infrastructure on humans rather than on computers. All right, how do we do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's talk about what does an internal infrastructure product need. We have a couple themes that we think are important. We're going back to this idea that a product has a coherent narrative and a clear audience. And so the three things we think you need to do this well are vision, resonance, and trustworthiness. Vision. So, building good products requires vision. It requires you being able to see possibilities to have impact beyond what's immediately visible. Working in infrastructure is actually a really good place to do this because it gives you a unique window to technical possibilities, company goals, and social dynamics. You're in a position in infrastructure to see a future that's better than just what's over the next hill, just what's beyond the next outage, right? And vision is by no means unique to a product approach. And actually, in my experience, infrastructure engineers have really cool visions of what the future could be if the right pieces fell into place. They can see what a good system, they often have a feel of what a good system would look like, and they wish they worked in one. But a lot of times, infrastructure teams have a more day-to-day, tactical, smaller focus, and they aren't given space or time to focus on long-term vision. Treating your infrastructure as an actual product is one way to unlock that vision. It's a way to build a framework for why you're taking a given step now, or why you're making a given trade-off. It helps you organize your plans in a way that management is more likely to support, and that users are more likely to engage with, which feeds back into that support. Now, this isn't just a free ticket to sit around dreaming all day and building castles in the sky. Being empowered to execute on vision comes with responsibility. You have to be able to follow through. You have a responsibility to weigh different options and choose what's best for the organization over a longer period of time. So vision is really the backbone of your product's narrative. It's why you're making a product instead of just working reactively and putting out fires as they come up. So that story. Now remember, products tell a story about how they're going to make someone's life better. If people are going to choose your product, though, that story has to resonate with them, right? Not all stories are for all people. You won't improve anyone's life if they don't choose to be part of that story. And part of telling a story that really resonates with your users is telling it in a way that they understand. And this is honestly something that we think infrastructure engineers, ourselves included, struggle with. It has to be relevant to your user's experience. It has to be in a language they're familiar with, told in a setting that they feel comfortable in. Your story should target their level of expertise and also acknowledge and address the external pressures that they feel, which may be different than the external pressures you feel. And it isn't just about telling the story in a way that sounds good or looks pretty. That kind of formulation assumes that you're telling the right story to begin with. A vision isn't enough to make a resonant product. You also need, beyond the vision, you need to talk to your users, and you need to listen to how they view their problems. Being condescending is really kind of a big problem with infrastructure and operations teams. I think most people have encountered this. If your users think that you don't respect them, they're not going to trust you. You have to be humble, you have to be a listener, and you have to be open to ideas that you haven't thought about before or that maybe even seem wrong to you on the face of it. It's often better to compromise your vision in the short term in order to build something that resonates, because you do always have that iteration available to you, and you especially do if you can build that trust over the long term. You'll always be able to iterate, get to that next step in the future. You have to remember that the point of a product is to make someone's life better, and people know their own lives pretty well. They're the experts, right? If your product resonates with your users, there's a good chance that it will actually deliver on that story that you tell. Of course, you do actually have to deliver, right? And so the third element that we identify as being really critical to delivering your infrastructure as a product is trustworthiness. Because getting users to buy into your vision is tricky. It's very hard, actually, because you're asking them to invest in something that may not be complete yet. You're asking them to do some work now, to do some buy-in now, to support what you know is awesomeness, but that won't come till later. And you're asking them, at the core of it, you're asking them to trust you. Now, whether or not they will, it depends on an element of your own presentation and your own actions. It depends on how trustworthy you are. How you build and communicate about your infrastructure product impacts how trustworthy your team and your products are perceived as. And this might sound like old hat to you, right? Especially if you're someone who, you're like, I'm super trustworthy. I work all night to keep the site up, right? But it's actually not just about, say, meeting your SLOs, having a high number of nines, having great uptime. Those things are amazing, keep doing them, but trust is not a binary property. You don't cross a certain finish line and cross a threshold and then get it. It's a feeling, it's extremely human. It means that one of the best ways to build trust in how humans interact with your product is its interface, is at the point that they're interacting. The interface is sort of the look and feel of your infrastructure. That includes its literal code interfaces, could include an API, could include scripts. It includes, the UI, obviously, whether that's a GUI or whether that's a command line or something else, chat ops, say. It includes the documentation. A really critical thing that the interface includes is the interactions you have with your users. So that's not necessarily something you can storyboard, right? But how your users are treated and what the experience they have when they're trying to get help in chat or email or issue trackers is really critical to the interface of your infrastructure product. Some properties of a trustworthy interface and a trustworthy product are that it's consistent. Do you communicate with a consistent voice? Do you use the important terms to your product consistently across your documentation and support? Is it sometimes server, sometimes node, sometimes host? You want to really narrow down on that. Do techniques that users learn about one part of your product apply in other parts? If there's one way to deploy, say, a change to networking, is that also how you deploy a change to capacity? It needs to be understandable. If your users are confused by you, it's hard to trust them, right? It's hard for them to trust you. You want to speak and work in their language, and that can be really hard if you've been steeped in this a while, and it's important to try to break out of that and find out where you're losing folks. And then finally, it needs to be aligned. One of the quickest ways to gain trust is if your infrastructure is clearly designed for exactly the use case that a user has. On the flip side of that, if you need to do something and you come to the infrastructure team and what they tell you to do seems really far off from what you're trying to do, that you feel like you can't trust them, right? They don't understand what you're actually going for. Now, these are all things that are under your control, and they're separate from the core technology, right? You can do this on Docker, you can do this with Bash scripts, you can do this on many different technologies. They're about like the look and feel, or the interface that you present, irrespective of the implementation. A cool thing about trust is that over time it builds up. Users who think that you're trustworthy are more willing to take a leap of faith and collaborate with you to build your vision. All right, that's all pretty abstract. Let's see some actual examples, right? So to illustrate these themes, we're going to share stories from our rollout of Kubernetes at GitHub. Kubernetes is a system for deploying and managing containerized applications across clusters of hosts. Don't worry about it. It's not super relevant to the actual examples, but we can talk Kube afterwards all you want. We ended up, in our rollout of Kube, taking something that's normally just infrastructure, which is running code at a web company, and building it as a product. And this has been a gradual process. We didn't start out knowing we were going to do this, right? We were actually focused on building out Kubernetes to underpin the use of services to replace GitHub's monolithic architecture. As we made progress on that, though, we realized that our concerns were really similar to product development, and instead of sort of reinventing the wheel, we made the conscious decision to treat it that way and to draw on learning and experience from that field. So it started with a vision. It started with a vision that Kubernetes was going to be the backbone of our service platform. But we had only done a proof of concept project with it to sort of validate some base assumptions and to sort of get the shiny momentum going among our team. We want to use this is going to solve some of our problems. We had a choice after we built that proof of concept we had sort of a fork in the road, right? We could either dive right in, build out the whole service platform for new services, all in Kubernetes, everyone's going to have to use this, we're building this platform, it's going to take us a while, but that's the future. Another option that we had was to just go ahead and fully port the workload that we had proof of concepted to Kubernetes in production. So to take it a little beyond a proof of concept. The first option, that full service platform, that was closer to our long-term goals. But we didn't feel like we had enough experience with Kubernetes to ask others to trust a platform built on it, right? That's a little bit of hubris. We decided instead to go the second route, and we ported the entire GitHub web and HTTP API, which is mostly in one code base, to Kubernetes to build that confidence. We opted to port the monolith to Kubernetes as a way to build trustworthiness in the technology and in the work that our team does. Choosing to port the monolith had a bunch of advantages to do that first. Our monolith is a big service. It requires a lot of compute infrastructure. This allowed us to become comfortable with building and maintaining large Kubernetes clusters, right? We felt confident that we could take on any workload at this point. Our monolith also takes a lot of traffic, and if there were going to be scaling problems at GitHub scale, which is significant, this project was going to shine light on them, right? We were going to find out before other folks had gotten invested. And finally, a lot of developers at GitHub at the time worked primarily in the monolith. in this code base because it comprised so much of our business logic. And so we had a lot of expertise we could draw on to verify things. Many eyeballs make shallow bugs, right? We knew that we were going to encounter issues because we had so many folks who were touching adjacent work. Not only did this project, which was a little bit counterintuitive to take the biggest chunk first, have benefits for our team building trust in Kubernetes, it also helped us make our eventual product more trustworthy. So developers became used to deploying their code to Kubernetes every day while working in a stack they were already familiar with. So we were sort of limiting the amount of change that we were introducing. When they did eventually begin to make standalone services or extract bits of code, they already have associated Kubernetes with something that they trust to work and be reliable and to have benefits. Developers also became used to a platform built by our team powering their code. Focusing on that existing service meant that we focused on building infrastructure that conformed to developers' existing expectations. And since they already have trust in existing systems, right? They trust that the website and the API will be up and that our teams will work hard to keep them up. We were able to latch onto that and sort of borrow some trust, right? In the end, we had the foundations of trustworthiness for us to build a service platform on top of. We delivered infrastructure that powered a really, really large scale application, right? Lots of traffic, lots of computers, lots of deploys. Our team and our technology choices had credibility now. And we had also set expectations on an interface front. We set expectations for how we would introduce changes to underlying infrastructure. We would attempt to make infrastructure changes that impact devs' workflow as little as possible. We try to give plenty of heads up if it does impact behavior change. Setting the expectations for that tone of communication about changes and expectations for responsiveness when there were issues was a huge part of gaining that trust of developers in our company. So this went so well, this initial port, that we deployed a cluster that was open to any apps, not just the monolith, just to see, what would people try? What would they put on there? And surprisingly, we actually got quite a bit of interest. Multiple teams deployed apps on Kubernetes with our assistance onto this cluster. And at this point, we saw this happening and we're sort of thinking, how do we build on this? If the next step in our journey to Kubernetes for everything running on Kubernetes makes a strong impression, we'll really multiply our trustworthiness, right? We'll have these couple of wins in a row and we'll be in a really good spot. But how do we make that good first impression? And we did that by focusing on features that were most resonant with our users, going back to that idea of resonance, of really listening to the people using our product. What we did is we actually looked at the issues that our early adopters and our beta testers had filed and the questions they'd asked in chat and the issues they had raised, and we looked for patterns. What had our users told us was important to them? What were their challenges? What were their dreams? What were their pressures? It was really exciting because we had all that already available to us. We didn't have to go out and do further surveys because we had the bugs that were filed. We had interactions with chat. It's important to realize what a wealth of product information you're already sitting on as an infrastructure team. When we did this, the common thread that we saw when we took this first look was getting an app set up on the platform. Because our product was new, our platform was new, that had been the focus of most of the early adopter teams, right? They wanted to get up and running rather than longer term goals, rather than stability or performance. They wanted to, everyone who was starting with us, these early adopters, were onboarding into the product. It makes sense, right? They were still building trust in us. So they might be deploying lower risk things, smaller things, newer apps because they wanted to make sure this was something that would work. We also noticed a handful of folks had a really hard time getting set up. There was still a lot of boilerplate in this initial rollout, and some subtle bits were really easy to get wrong in hard to find ways. And so we thought, hey, there's a good opportunity here, right? Onboarding onto our product is difficult. Let's fix that. So to make our onboarding features really resonate with our users, we started from that point and we did a little more research. Non-infrastructure UX, user experience designers, often talk about user stories or user journeys as a way of mapping out flows, and we decided to give this a try. They're the experts in this, right? So we wanted to rely on that. We had a lot to learn, but it was a really useful exercise. We wrote out a user story of how to do the first deploy of an application. And we first did this, we went through the process of how it was without any improvements. And at that time, right, there were things we knew were broken, right? There were things we knew weren't right. And they seemed obviously challenging or wrong to us. But we wanted to double check our assumptions by comparing those trouble points we thought we saw and we had identified to the actual experience of our users. We reached out to developers who had had significant pain, including some who abandoned Kubernetes halfway through. And we talked to them about what their goals had been and what they had hoped it would have been like or looked like. These conversations and user stories pointed to a particular set of features. Adding a new app required deploying our change to our deploy tool so it would know about your app, kind of circular. So we moved that configuration into the apps repo under the user's control to simplify the process. And then people were copy-pasting kube configs and deploy configs to set up their apps, but often from out-of-date or even broken examples. And so we made a quick tool that would generate a fully working HTTP service so that developers could focus on their code rather than wrangling the service platform. But when they were ready to deploy, it was going on the service platform. When we built those features out, we regularly did real-life tests of making new test applications in order to experience what we were going to ship to users. And that was really important to have that tight iteration loop. One of the other most important things that we did at this stage, which it doesn't seem like infrastructure work at all, is we branded our infra product. Now, this was Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes at GitHub. But we gave our platform a different name. We said this is Moda. And we made it clear that all these new tools and patterns were a part of Moda at GitHub. Moda is a set of tools, norms, and documentation, and Kubernetes-based infrastructure for running services at GitHub. In actuality, all of those elements are deployed and delivered continuously, right? We work on them, we ship them, we work on them, we ship them. But we intentionally developed a cadence of distinct releases. Each release of Moda comes with a themed set of features. We say, oh, this is the first Moda release, it's about onboarding. It comes with new documentation, it comes with release notes, and it comes with quite a bit of fanfare on our part, right? We make a big deal out of it. This establishes our product's narrative, right? And specifically, it helps us to highlight resonance. This name, Moda, gives coherence to a set of norms and tools. It helps us define what our product is and also what it isn't. This first release of Moda was all about the onboarding experience. Now, we could have used that first release to focus on where we're going, right? We could have put a stake in the ground for what we think a service platform should provide or require when it's mature. But we didn't, because that wouldn't resonate with our users. Frankly, they don't care. They just want to get their apps up, right? We met them where they were at that point, which was just getting started. And we listened to them, we used product ideas to focus our efforts, and we delivered a release that enabled an order of magnitude more developers to begin working with Moda. So what comes after that, right? After you get started, what comes next? So this is where our vision comes in. And this is an exciting step for us getting to push this vision out. As we grew our platform, we learned a lot about the failure modes of underlying Kubernetes infrastructure and different ways to mitigate those failure modes. We love the way that Kubernetes handles server failures, and we wanted to extend that idea to whole clusters. We also were part of internal conversations about extending GitHub infrastructure into more data centers, more regions. What would that entail? What would app owners have to do? What does failover look like in a world that has a slightly different setup? Some of our users were really interested in those conversations as well. They wanted to make their apps as reliable as possible. They were interested in what they could do to be ready for running in more data centers. Having a seat at all of these tables, being builders of the service platform, being part of the discussions of the future of infrastructure within our org, and also hearing what our users are doing and are interested in, sets our team up uniquely to have a solid vision of what the future could be like of building GitHub at GitHub. We saw clusters as the fundamental unit of failover and resilience for most apps. And we saw how that could be a good abstraction to ease apps in, I know, I think so too, to ease apps in to running in more data centers, running in more regions, running in different modes. It also helps with upgrades, right? To have a flexible concept of failover and of a really flexible concept of resilience. We were part of all the right projects to start laying this groundwork that could be used when the other parts fell into place, when we were ready to roll out. We invested in features for declaring an app as multi-cluster capable. So how do users think about routing their traffic, about deploying to multiple places, about getting stats for multiple deployments, right? We built relationships with the data center team so that that will be setting up this new hardware so that we could have robust communication and high trust on both ends. We prototyped new features by reaching out to our power users who were already interested in these resiliency concepts to ensure that we were building the right abstractions and got their insight as well. So the payoff to that, I'm gonna admit it, it's been slow, right? In some form, we've been investing in this as an organization for over a year. But because our team has sort of called our shot and we've named our vision, we're able to get support from management. We not only have a vision for what the future's gonna be like, but we're also taking responsibility for delivering that vision and for delivering that future and for ensuring that that future is the right one and that our users are set up to take advantage of it. There are short-term wins as well, right? Because we're treating this iteratively. Each release addressing our users' current pain points also moves us forward towards this long-term vision of resilience. Our last release let early adopters opt in to having their apps work in multiple clusters. Our next one is going to include tools to test failure tolerance on the app level. This is alongside other features like, for example, gRPC support, which we found out was important by getting tickets filed by various teams asking for it. So broadly, the win here is building trust in us, because people know we're working on problems they care about, right? You might abstractly care about multi-cluster resilience, but you really want to use gRPC right now. We also are building trust because the people know that we're working on the problems that they care about, and they're excited to be early adopters. And a concept from product development is that early adopters are really key, both because they're active participants in smoothing out the product experience, and also because they tend to have a high degree of influence over future users. They multiply our work and our reach in ways that we would never be able to do on our own. So, how are we going to wrap this up? Well, I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face in this approach, right? How do we support all these devs? Especially as we're trying to balance reactive incoming problem work and long-term vision. How do we prioritize the work that we want to do? How do we choose what features we want to build? How do we get a lot of feature requests, so it's not as simple as just first in, first out or anything like that. Our decisions really do impact other people's workflow, right? So how do we do that respectfully, and how do we do that with the maximum amount of buy-in? How do we balance the needs of those early adopters I was talking about, those power users, with newer users who maybe aren't as invested in this platform working out? And how do we stay up to date compared to other solutions out there, right? Because like I said, before you know it, folks will sneak away and you'll be like, what is that? And they're like, oh, it's running in Heroku, don't worry about it. How do we make sure that we are providing the things that folks need? So these questions are exactly what product managers answer day in and day out about product development, right? If you develop a product, all of this should be really familiar. That's really exciting, right? We have a lot to learn and we have great people to learn it from. Actually, I'm excited because our new product manager is sitting in the audience right now, who's going to work exclusively on that with us, which is really exciting. We have a lot to learn from people who've built products before, and we need to listen, not just to our customers, but we need to listen to those in other fields, right? Infrastructure as a field, as mentioned, has a reputation of being grumpy and homogenous and hard to talk to. We can do better than that, and I believe in us, and I know that we can erase that bad stereotype and that bad reputation. We can focus on humans, and I want to see where that focus on humans could take us. Finally, I would love to hear what you're doing on this front, if any of this resonates or doesn't. If there's things that you're doing at your organization or your company, please come and talk to me, tweet at us, email us, let us know. We want to spread this everywhere. And thank you for coming.